About 12 years ago, on this very same Queen's campus that's hosting this TED Talk, a male friend walked me home after a night of partying together. When we got to my door, he asked if he could kiss me, and I said no. I said that wasn't a very good idea because we were friends, but I was giggling and I was trying to keep things light. And then he kissed me anyway. I didn't yell, I didn't fight back, I didn't push him away. And I calmly got through the experience and I walked to my front door. And when I woke up the next morning, I cried. I was confused about why I didn't push or say no or yell or run for help like I'd always been taught to. And so it was my fault. I did something wrong. I wasn't firm enough. I was clearly somehow defective. Then about 8 years ago, during my master's degree, a male supervisor drove us both towards a coffee shop after dinner together. And instead of a coffee shop, he drove us towards an abandoned parking lot. And when we got there, he asked to kiss me, leaning in, making it obvious there was only one actual answer. I didn't want to, but I let it happen, even saying yes, calmly getting through the experience until he finally drove me back to my car. And when I drove home that night, I cried, and when I woke up the next morning, I threw up. I was really, really bad at these situations. This was my fault. I didn't even say no this time. I was not doing what I was taught, and so this was my secret shame to carry. Again, I was the problem. And then as I continued my work as a psychotherapist, working with students, I started to hear story after story, just like my own. And at the same time, the Me Too movement was springing up all around us, on campuses and beyond. I heard stories from the young men and women who came through my office, carrying their own secret shames. There was the girl who gave a guy oral sex when he had them trapped in a bathroom together, asking to have sex with her. She didn't want to, but offered the oral sex as a way to get out of the intercourse she didn't want. She thought it was her fault that oral sex happened. Or the guy whose ex-girlfriend showed up uninvited at his apartment after a night of partying, and she was upset and sad and wouldn't leave until he had sex with her. And sex eventually happened. But he didn't want it, and his current girlfriend actually broke up with him after she found out. And he thought it was his fault that all this had happened. As each person came to me, they each carried their own secret shame, that they weren't firm enough in saying no, or that it was their fault for eventually saying yes. We were all taught that we were supposed to run, yell, fight back, anything. So what was going on? Why weren't we doing this? All I knew at the time was that it wasn't their fault, and I told them this. But I didn't really understand what was happening either. To figure out the mystery of what was going on to the students and to myself, I researched my book, Real Talk About Sex and Consent. And I discovered something crucial that explains what happened to each of us. Something that ends up being fundamental to our understanding of consent. And what we're about to talk about next is a really big deal. And it needs to be understood by all of us in order to change the future landscape of the Me Too movement. Now, before we dive in any deeper, let's make sure we're all on the same page of basic consent. So the most up-to-date, accurate definition of consent is legal, freely given, enthusiastically affirmative consent. This means that each person has the capacity to consent. That means there's no unsafe ages or unsafe power dynamics, that everyone has the conscious capacity and isn't intoxicated, and that everyone has the overall ability to consent. What I add to this in my book is an acronym called HOT SPICE, that each letter stands for another element that should be present in this basic consent. The H stands for honest. Each person has a chance to check in with themselves about what they truly do and don't want. The O is for ongoing, that this isn't just one moment of consent, that it's talked about throughout the sexual interaction. The T is for talked about. That means that it's a verbal conversation. The S is for specific, that everyone knows exactly what they are and are not consenting to. The P is for present moment, that it happens in that moment, not earlier in the day or at some other time. The I is for informed, that everyone knows any risks that might be involved. The C is for changeable, that any person, for any reason, at any time, can revoke their consent and the sexual intimacy must stop at that point. And the E is for that enthusiastically affirmative consent, not anything that's hesitant or withdrawn. So, now that we're all on the same page, what are we still missing? Because consent still isn't just asking a question and getting an answer. If it were, perhaps some of the stories I've told wouldn't be a problem. In those stories, consent was technically asked for, and in many of them, a yes was given at some point. But sometimes asking and getting a yes still isn't consent, because not every yes is created equal. Because sometimes yes actually means no, because the question should never have been asked in the first place. What does this mean, that consent should never have been asked for in the first place? Let's take a moment and break down this faulty equation, the one that assumes that consent is a question plus an answer. This equation doesn't take into account how our brains and our bodies function in real-life situations. The best way to actually understand what we're missing here is by reverse engineering the trauma state that happens as a result of non-consensual sex, which is sexual assault. Trauma happens when we don't feel safe, in a big way. So that means that consent then is inherently tied to safety. Consent, it turns out, is tantamount to safety. Safety is involved in every step of true and total consent. And in the absence of safety, instead of actual answers and true consent, we're actually likely to get survival responses instead. What are survival responses? Survival responses are what happen to us when we don't feel safe. And despite being taught to run, fight back, yell for help, or yell no, survival responses actually keep us safe in very different ways from this. They are aimed to keep us alive, which actually sometimes requires us not to fight back and risk escalating a situation that already feels unsafe. To understand this connection between safety and consent, I've created what I call the survival house. And this is a metaphor that helps understand our brains and bodies and what they're doing during moments of consent. And we're going to look at a part of this metaphor today. So as you can see in this diagram, we have three general systems in our brains and our nervous systems that come together to create three floors of responses in the survival house. The top floor is our social mammal part of our brains and bodies, our neocortex of the brain and the ventral vagal nervous system. Here we feel safe, we can be in groups, use language and memory, communicate, and be intimate. This is the floor that consent needs to happen on. If we don't feel safe, we drop one floor. Now we're in an older, more emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, and we're in the sympathetic nervous system. This is the floor that is known as the fight or flight system. But it's also a set of responses that we're often not taught about, and these are the fawn responses. These are freeze, appease, tend, and befriend. And these are survival responses. These responses can show up in us often before fight or flight as different urges or impulses. Because in many cases, running or fighting can feel riskier to our overall safety and our overall survival when we're already feeling unsafe. So the active freeze response looks like not making any decision one way or another until we know how bad something's going to be, like I ended up doing with my friend in university. Appeasing might look like offering something to keep someone else happy, and less scary, like the girl who offered oral sex. Tending and befriending can look like making sure the other person is safe and happy, even if we're not feeling okay, like the guy who ended up having sex with his ex, trying to keep her happy even though he felt cornered. So then, if we're on this second floor and we feel trapped or helpless, we'll actually likely fall one level further, because the pathways to that whole system are blocked of fight or flight. We cannot fight if we are helpless, and we cannot flight if we are trapped. Then here on the bottom floor, we're in the oldest part of our brains and our bodies evolutionarily, the cerebellum and brainstem and the dorsal vagal complex. And this is our body's last resort to keep us safe. It's sending us signals to be passive and to not provoke the attacker, to just survive the experience. And we're likely to dissociate and robotically get through the situation, shut down, hide, or play dead. And this is the situation that happened with my supervisor. There was already a helpless trigger as he was in a position of power over me. And then further, I was both helpless and trapped in the parking lot. And so, during the situation, I dissociated, just surviving, not knowing how bad things could get if I didn't comply. And it turns out that I actually reacted normally, but I wasn't taught to expect it. And so, I ended up feeling confused and ashamed for years, just like many of the students were in their own stories. For anyone who's watching this right now, who has a story or a feeling similar to one of these, I want you to know right now that you did nothing wrong. Your body was in survival mode, making moment-to-moment calculations to try to help keep you safe and alive. And whatever happened, whatever you did, it wasn't your fault. So what we've now learned here are two new truths about consent. We've learned that we need a consent question asked verbally in an environment of safety in order to get an actual answer, which is true and total consent. We've also learned that if we have a consent question asked verbally in the absence of safety, we are likely to get a survival response, which is not true consent. A survival response means that our brains and body are in a state of trauma in those bottom two floors. And trauma is awful and serious and horrible to live with. And it can happen after just one situation like this. And it can stay with people their entire lives in the absence of treatment. So the stakes are really, really high that we get this consent equation right. It turns out that safety is therefore paramount. And it is each of our responsibility in consent situations that we have it and we create it with each other. So this means that then the work ahead of us is to understand what safety looks and feels like. So how can we ensure that we have safety with our partners? We can think about the things that make each of us feel more safe, like respect, kindness, healthy communication, integrity, and trust. And we can build this with each other and offer it, even in short-term flings or one-night arrangements. So what else helps us feel safe during moments of consent? Well, it turns out there are 4 additional dimensions of safety we need to consider. There's legal, social, emotional, and physical. And each of those are what help us stay in that top floor of the survival house. So what does this look like? Well, that legal safety is what we talked about, having that freely given, enthusiastically affirmative, hot spice consent with capacity. And then after that, we have to have our partners feeling socially safe, that they can say no to us and express what they truly do and don't want without fear of losing something important or that they may depend on, like an important friend, group, or partner on a group project. They need to emotionally feel safe and trust and know that we will still be kind and respectful with us, even if they say no. They need to physically know that they are safe, for instance, that they can still get home safely from our house, even if they turn us down for something sexual. So taking all this then, our consent equation develops further. We then have that verbal consent question asked in that environment of safety, legally, socially, emotionally, and physically. And this is where we can get an actual true and consent answer. But there's now one more thing we need to consider. Humans are complicated. Inside of us, we each have deep evolutionary wiring from our days as hunter-gatherers that compels us to need to stay safe and accepted in our social groups for safety and survival. So, along with this and the rest of our societal influences, biology, and that evolutionary history, we then have 5 main triggers that cause us to feel particularly unsafe. These are the triggers of abandoned, rejected, trapped, helpless, and out of control. These are triggers that cause us to fall from that top floor of consent and safety into those bottom 2 floors. And the further we get from that top floor, we leave those skills and abilities further behind, and it's harder to access things like memory and language. And this, therefore, impacts communication. And consent, at its roots, is communication. So anything impacting communication is impacting consent. So if we look closely at each of these triggers, we can actually start to uncover some things that we may not have originally thought were that big of a deal. So these are sometimes common in the dating world. For instance, if we ask for intimacy more than once, we can make the other person feel helpless and like they have no voice, and this can trigger them into those fawn responses. If we come on too strong, trying to have game, we can make someone else feel trapped, like there's no way out, or that we won't take no for an answer, and we can trigger them into those bottom 2 floors. If we imply, even slightly, that a relationship is in any way dependent on a sexual activity, we can trigger the other person to feel abandoned, rejected, and this can then create those subconscious survival responses that may try to help them preserve that relationship. If we move too fast or skip through intimacy too quickly, we may cause an out-of-control trigger in the other person. Because for true consent, each person actually needs to feel in control of the who, what, when, where, why, and how of all aspects of a sexual encounter. So together, this brings us to our final equation. We have an updated new normal. We need legal, freely given, hot spice, enthusiastic affirmative consent in a context of safety. We need that consent question plus safety, legally, socially, emotionally, and physically, in an absence of triggers, which are abandoned, rejected, trapped, helpless, and out of control. And this is where we can get an actual answer of true and total consent. Otherwise, if we're not following this equation, we may get survival responses instead, and that's not true consent. Consent is more than just a question and an answer. This assumption misses the humanity of the interaction. It doesn't consider how our brains and our bodies work when we don't feel safe. So instead, consent is an entire environment of developing trust and safety with each other, even if it's just a one-night thing. It's a complete way of approaching intimacy altogether. From start to finish, it matters how we set things up with each other. Safety needs to be present at every point. So where do we go from here? We need to teach each other and the next generation coming up about true and total consent. Because only when we truly understand how our brain and bodies work can we hope to truly understand consent. And if we do this, perhaps one day we can look back at the Me Too movement as one we were able to leave behind in history. And if you're watching this right now, you can be a part of that change. Start by talking and sharing about what you've learned here today. Take an action that can ripple out and change the world, because it's too important not to. Thank you.